The dirt beneath your feet right now is quiet, but if you dig down far enough, you will find a layer of earth that remembers when the world was a completely different place. A silent, white wasteland where the sky was a permanent haze of frozen dust and the ground was locked in a perpetual iron-hard freeze. And if you were to stand in that ancient wind with nothing but your bare skin, the air would steal warmth from your blood so fast that your heart would stop beating before the sun even finished setting. Today, we live in an era of absolute thermal privilege, where we can manipulate the temperature of our entire home with the gentle tap of a thumb on a glass screen, where we wear synthetic fabrics designed in high-tech laboratories to repel water and trap heat, and where the threat of freezing to death is something we only encounter in survival movies or on the news. But for nearly 99% of our evolutionary history, winter wasn't a season. You simply waited out in a cozy living room. It was a relentless, terrifying war of attrition that our ancestors had to fight every single day without a single modern tool at their disposal. To understand the sheer scale of the miracle that is your existence, we have to look at what was actually waiting for us outside the cave, because the last ice age, which reached its absolute brutal peak between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, was not a picturesque landscape of gently falling snow and quiet, pine-scented forests. It was a world of raw, screaming violence, where colossal sheets of ice, miles thick, sat on top of Europe, Asia, and North America, grinding the landscape down into flat, barren, open steppes where there was absolutely nothing to break the momentum of a howling polar wind. Trees were incredibly scarce. Fresh water was locked away in massive glaciers, and the sun would barely rise above the horizon for months at a time, leaving the world in a freezing twilight gray. And in the middle of this frozen hell stood a hairless tropical ape. We have to be honest about our own biology, because, structurally speaking, humans are built for the sweltering heat of the African savanna, not the Arctic wastes of the mammoth steppe. We do not possess a thick, insulating coat of fur like the wolves or the lions. We do not have a dense, specialized layer of blubber to protect our vital organs like a seal, and we cannot simply slow our hearts to a crawl and sleep through the worst of the freeze inside a warm den like a cave bear. If you strip a modern human naked and drop them into a real sub-zero winter, their body will begin to shut down in a matter of minutes as the blood vessels in the skin rapidly constrict to pull the remaining warmth toward the core, leaving the fingers and toes to freeze and die before the brain eventually succumbs to the cold, bringing a quiet, final sleep. Every animal our ancestors shared the landscape with was beautifully, perfectly engineered for the cold, as the woolly mammoths carried dual-layer fur coats and thick layers of fat beneath their skin. The reindeer possessed hollow hair, coats that trapped warm air, and specialized hooves that allowed them to walk over the snow, and even the predators had massive insulated paws to navigate the ice. Humans had none of those things, and on paper, we should have been one of the very first species to vanish when the glaciers began to march south. Yet we didn't. We didn't die out because we possessed a weapon that no physical adaptation could ever match: a highly creative brain that could plan for a future it hadn't seen yet, and a pair of hands that could build the very things our bodies were missing. But this wasn't a battle won by a single brilliant invention, because surviving a 30,000-year winter required an entire ecosystem of clever, interlocking solutions, where each new trick solved the problem that would have otherwise meant the end of our species. And it all began with the technology we had been carrying with us for hundreds of thousands of years: fire. Our ancestors had been taming the flame for a very long time, with evidence of hearths stretching back at least 300,000 to 400,000 years. But by the time the Ice Age reached its peak, fire had ceased to be a simple luxury and had become the absolute center of human survival. When archaeologists began excavating ancient Ice Age campsites in Ukraine, they expected to find the remains of simple, unstructured campfires. But what they actually uncovered were highly sophisticated engineered fireplaces that had been constructed with deliberate thermal draft systems. One of these fireplaces had burned at a temperature exceeding 600 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, proving that our ancestors possessed an incredibly advanced understanding of thermodynamics. But on the flat, treeless steppe, finding enough wood to keep a fire burning at those temperatures was a constant, exhausting struggle, forcing humans to look to a highly unusual, energy-dense alternative fuel source, the very bones and fat of the massive beasts they hunted. When wood was scarce, they would pack their hearts with marrow-rich mammoth bones and animal fat, which would catch fire and burn with a slow, intense, and incredibly hot flame, acting like a primitive oil lamp that could keep a shelter warm and illuminated for hours after the sun had set. This constant source of intense heat did more than just keep their limbs from freezing. It allowed them to cook raw meat, which unlocked a massive wave of easily digestible calories to feed their expanding brain. It let them harden the tips of their wooden hunting weapons, and it stretched the short, dark winter days by, adding several hours of precious light, giving them the time they needed to sit together, plan, and create. Yet the fundamental problem with a fire is that you cannot take it with you when you leave the shelter, and the moment you step away from the embers. The freezing wind is waiting to pull the warmth from your body. To survive, humans had to figure out how to carry a microclimate of warmth with them wherever they walked. And they did this by taking the natural insulation of other animals and wrapping it around themselves. At first, this clothing was incredibly simple, just raw, heavy animal skins thrown over the shoulders to block the wind. We know that humans were skinning massive cave bears for their fur, in northern Europe at least, 300,000 years ago, because archaeologists have found tiny, precise cut marks left on the delicate paw bones of these ancient predators, right where a skilled hunter would cut to pull a heavy hide off cleanly. These bear skins made magnificent windproof and waterproof cloaks, but a loose, draped hide carries a fatal flaw, because every time you move, the warm air trapped against your body leaks out through the gaps, and the freezing air rushes in to take its place. The solution to this problem arrived around 30,000 years ago, and it is an invention so small, so simple, and so incredibly elegant that we often take it for granted today: the sewing needle. Carved painstakingly from thin slivers of animal bone or mammoth ivory, with a microscopic hole drilled through one end using a tiny stone tool, the needle is considered by many historians to be one of the most important technological breakthroughs in all of human history. Before the needle, clothing was just something you wrapped around yourself. But with the needle, clothing became something you could sew, allowing our ancestors to create fitted, form-fitting, multi-layered garments that closed tightly around the body. They could now sew sleeves that sealed snugly at the wrist, trousers that trapped heat around the legs, and heavy, insulated hoods that shielded the face from the wind, creating a sealed pocket of warm air that stayed with the hunter even during a brutal blizzard. This tailored clothing was so vastly superior to the loose, draped hides used by Neanderthals that many scientists believe it was the primary reason modern humans managed to thrive during the coldest peaks of the Ice Age. While our stockier cousins slowly faded into extinction, our ancestors didn't just stop at sewing heavy coats, because they also learned to use different types of animal hides for highly specific purposes, utilizing tough, wind-resistant deer hide for the outer layers of their mittens, and waterproof boots, while lining the insides with soft hair fur or dried grass to create an incredibly effective insulation system. And before they ever stepped out of their shelters into the freezing air, hunters would rub a thick layer of animal fat, known as tallow, directly onto their exposed faces and necks. This greasy barrier did something brilliant. It sealed the skin against the dry, biting air, preventing the moisture from evaporating and stopping the wind from rapidly pulling the warmth away from their flesh. But as they walked out onto the endless, dazzling white plains of the steppe, they faced another silent, blinding danger that most people today completely forget about: snow blindness. The intense glare of the sun, reflecting off vast, unbroken snowfields can sunburn the cornea of your eyes, causing excruciating pain and temporary blindness. That, in the prehistoric wild, was an immediate death sentence. To protect their vision, northern hunters carved thin, curved strips of bone or wood, cutting narrow, horizontal slits directly across the center before tying them tightly over their eyes. These ingenious devices cut down the blinding glare of the snow while still allowing a wide, clear field of view, creating the world's very first sunglasses tens of thousands of years before the invention of modern glass. When we think of Ice Age human, we almost always picture them huddled inside dark, damp caves, but the reality is far more impressive, because across the frozen, open plains of what is now Ukraine and Russia, there were no caves to be found, and trees were far too scarce to build wooden log cabins. So our ancestors looked around the barren landscape, saw the massive skeletons of the giants they had hunted, and decided to build their homes out of mammoth bones. At the legendary archaeological site of Mezhirich, scientists uncovered several circular houses, constructed almost entirely from the bones and tusks of woolly mammoths, dating back 18,000 years to the absolute coldest, most unforgiving part of the Ice Age. The construction of these bone huts was a marvel of ancient engineering, as our ancestors would sink massive mammoth skulls and heavy leg bones deep into the frozen earth to serve as a solid interlocking foundation that could withstand the fiercest winds. Then they would curve the massive sweeping tusks and rib bones upward and inward, joining them at the top to form a strong, self-supporting dome. A single one of these bone houses required the remains of hundreds of individual mammoths, and once the skeletal frame was complete, the builders would cover the entire structure with thick animal hides, heavy turf, and layers of earth, packing the gaps with moss and clay to seal out the wind. The resulting home was so incredibly well insulated that the heat from a small central hearth could keep an entire extended family comfortable through a sub-zero winter. And the site was so successful that archaeological evidence shows these bone houses were used and maintained by generations of humans over hundreds of years. But the cleverness of these ancient architects didn't stop at the walls, because they also designed their winter homes with a feature known as a cold trap doorway. To enter the hut, you had to crawl through a tunnel that was dug slightly lower than the main living and sleeping area inside, the dome. Because cold air is heavy and naturally sinks, the freezing air from the outside would settle down into the entrance trench and remain trapped there, while the warm, light air generated by the fire in the family's bodies would rise and stay pooled in the elevated living area where everyone slept. Our ancestors figured out this complex principle of physics tens of thousands of years before anyone ever wrote down a single law of thermodynamics, using the natural behavior of air to keep their homes cozy and warm. They also understood how to use the landscape itself as a shield against the elements, choosing to build their winter camps in the shelter of dense forests whenever possible, because a thick stand of trees blocks a massive amount of wind, making a brutal winter day feel surprisingly calm compared to the open plains. And for the tiny drafts and cracks that still managed to seep through their walls, they created a primitive caulking by mixing mud, moss, and pine pitch, the sticky, resinous sap harvested from pine trees, which they smeared into every gap, sealing their shelters as tightly as any modern home. They even used the very snow that threatened to kill them as a source of insulation, piling thick drifts of it against the outer walls of their shelters, because they knew that snow is actually a magnificent insulator, with its tiny trap pockets of air, preventing the heat inside the hut from escaping into the freezing night. Long before anyone perfected the design of the Arctic igloo, Ice Age humans already knew that sitting beneath a thick blanket of snow was vastly warmer than standing out in the open wind above it. But keeping your body warm through the night is only half the battle of survival, because winter carries a slower, far more relentless killer hunger. For months on end, the frozen earth produced absolutely no plants, berries, or roots to gather, and the herds of reindeer and bison were constantly on the move, meaning that if a tribe did not find a way to save food ahead of time, they would starve long before the spring thaw arrived. To beat the winter famine, our ancestors became masters of food preservation, turning the freezing climate of the Ice Age into their greatest asset. When they made a massive kill during the late autumn, they didn't just feast and waste the rest Instead, they relied on the natural freezing temperatures of the steppe to preserve the meat, laying the carcasses out on the ice where they would freeze solid, keeping the meat fresh and safe from bacteria for months. They also developed highly effective preservation techniques that didn't rely on the weather, smoking large quantities of meat over their fires to infuse it with natural antimicrobial compounds that prevented spoilage, and slicing game into thin strips to dry it in the wind, creating lightweight, nutrient-dense jerky that could be carried easily and stored indefinitely. They dug deep subterranean storage pits directly into the permafrost, creating permanent underground freezers where food could be kept safe from both decay and hungry scavengers throughout the entire year. There is even fascinating archaeological evidence suggesting that they would weigh down massive chunks of mammoth meat with heavy stones and sink them to the bottom of cold, deep spring-fed ponds where the near-freezing low-oxygen water acted exactly like a modern refrigerator, keeping the meat perfectly preserved for months at a time without requiring a single watt of electricity. This incredible ability to store food was backed by a highly organized strategic approach to hunting, which relied on deep teamwork and a profound understanding of the landscape. At a famous archaeological site in eastern France, beneath a towering limestone rock, researchers discovered that generations of Ice Age hunters had used the natural geography of the cliffs to trap wild herds. By working together to light fires and make loud noises, they would panic entire herds of wild horses and reindeer, driving them directly into a narrow, rocky cul-de-sac where they could be easily hunted from a safe distance. This exact same trap was used by humans over and over again for tens of thousands of years, providing the tribe with a massive, predictable harvest of meat and hides right before the onset of winter, allowing them to dry and store enough food to easily survive the dark months ahead. They wasted absolutely nothing, utilizing every single scrap of the animal, the bones for fuel and building material, the hides for clothing and shelter, the sinews for thread, and the fat for food and fire. But perhaps the most powerful tool our ancestors possessed was not a weapon or a building, but their reliance on each other. Because in the freezing dark of the Ice Age, isolation was an immediate death sentence. They lived, slept, and worked packed closely together inside their insulated shelters, sharing their physical warmth in a highly deliberate practice of communal survival. In those small, cozy spaces, body heat was treated as a vital currency, and the idea of having a room to yourself would have seemed like madness, because a person sleeping alone was a person who was cold, exposed, and vulnerable. It was almost always the individuals who became separated from the group, particularly the old or the sick, who were the first to lose their lives during a sudden, severe cold snap, because they lacked the collective, life-saving thermal buffer of the tribe. Yet, this life was undeniably brutal, and when the cold went too deep and the herds of game failed to arrive, our ancestors were forced to face the most terrifying, desperate choices a human can make. We know from the cold, hard evidence of cut marks on human bones that when starvation became an immediate, looming reality, some ancient groups had no choice but to turn to cannibalism to keep the remaining members of the tribe alive, reminding us of the immense, tragic price that survival sometimes demanded. But whenever they could, they used their creativity to find warmth in unexpected places, a practice that continued long after the Ice Age ended. In the brutal winters of medieval Europe and Russia, peasants would bring their cows, sheep, and pigs directly into the ground floor of their homes during the coldest months of the year, living on the upper floor directly above the stables, because a single cow generates an enormous amount of body heat, which would rise through the floorboards to warm the family sleeping above, turning their livestock into a living, breathing furnace. Sometimes the pressure of the cold was so intense and lasted for so long that the human body itself began to adapt. On a genetic level, the Yagan people, who lived at the freezing, windswept southern tip of South America, survived for generations in near-freezing temperatures, while wearing almost no clothing, because their bodies had adapted to run at a significantly higher metabolic rate than ours, generating more internal heat from the food they ate. They also utilized a highly specialized resting posture, squatting tightly with their knees pulled close to their chest and their arms tucked in, which dramatically reduced the surface area of their skin exposed to the cold, turning their own bodies into compact heat-retaining spheres, a concept that sounds like science fiction but is still actively debated by paleontologists today. At an ancient archaeological site in northern Spain known as the Pit of Bones, researchers studying the 430,000-year-old skeletal remains of early human ancestors discovered something incredibly strange in their bones. The bones showed a pattern of seasonal damage and interrupted growth that occurred like clockwork every single year, pointing to a severe lack of vitamin D and signs of metabolic stress that are identical to the bone damage seen in animals that hibernate. This has led some prominent scientists to suggest that these ancient ancestors, facing a brutal, resource-barren winter with almost no fatty food to survive on, may have retreated deep into the darkness of caves, where they slowed their heart rates and entered a state of seasonal metabolic depression, effectively sleeping through the worst of the freeze to wait for the spring. While this theory remains highly controversial, with many scientists arguing that the bone damage could have been caused by disease or famine, the very fact that serious researchers are debating whether early humans could hibernate shows just how close our ancestors came to the absolute limits of biology. For hundreds of thousands of years, making it to the spring was never a guarantee. It was a hard-fought victory that had to be earned every single day through grit, intelligence, and a refusal to let the cold win. Our ancestors survived 30,000-year winters by wrapping themselves in the hides of cave bears, building houses out of the bone of giants, carving sunglasses from bone, and holding the flame high against the howling wind. And yet, in just a tiny fraction of that evolutionary timeline, we have managed to build a world where we have beaten winter so completely that we have forgotten it was ever a war we were losing. The very elements that once threatened to erase our entire species from the face of the earth have now been reduced to a minor inconvenience on our walk from the front door to a preheated car, and we live in a state of comfort so absolute that we complain about our coffees being slightly cold or our air conditioning being slightly too high. We are the descendants of the survivors, the ones who looked out at a world of ice and wind and refused to die, and their legacy is written directly into the warmth of your blood today. A quiet reminder of the incredible, unbreakable fire that has kept our species alive through the darkest winters this planet has ever seen.